This is the story of Yoshie Shiratori, a Japanese prisoner who escaped from 4 different prisons between 1936 and 1947. Miso soup corroded his iron bars. Dislocated shoulders let him squeeze through openings too small for any normal person. Friction alone carried him up walls lined with smooth copper, and a tunnel, dug with sharpened soup bowls, took him under the feet of 6 guards watching around the clock. Abashiri Prison, Japan's most notorious facility, had never lost an inmate before Shiratori broke out in 1944, and no one has escaped since. The Japanese called him the Escape King of the Showa era. And yet none of that is the most interesting part of his story. Shiratori didn't stop because someone finally built a cell strong enough to hold him, and he didn't stop because he lost the ability to break free. What ended his escape was something no prison architect could draft on paper, and it started with a single cigarette. Aomori Prefecture, in the far north of Japan, is where Yoshie Shiratori entered the world on July 31st, 1907. His father farmed the land and died of illness before the boy turned 3. Shortly after, his mother remarried and took only the youngest child with her, a nursing infant, leaving Shiratori and his older sister in the care of a paternal aunt who ran a tofu shop. Growing up meant deliveries and manual labor from an early age, and as a young man, Shiratori moved into fishing, including stints on Russian crab fishing vessels. Marriage came next, along with 3 children, a son and 2 daughters, but the Great Depression gutted his attempts at running a business. Gambling pulled him in first, and petty theft followed. On April 3rd, 1933, the 25-year-old Shiratori and 2 accomplices broke into a merchandise dealer's storehouse in Aomori Prefecture. The owner's adopted son chased them, and during the struggle that followed, someone fatally stabbed him. 2 years passed before an accomplice landed in custody and named Shiratori as the killer. Shiratori turned himself in during 1935, admitted to the robbery, and flatly denied the murder. Police, according to his account, subjected him to severe beatings until they extracted a confession. The Aomori District Court convicted him of robbery and murder in 1936 and shipped him off to Aomori Prison, where his wife eventually divorced him. That family he'd built, a son and 2 daughters, would never be whole again. Now, the question of whether Shiratori actually committed the killing has never been settled. Japan's pre-war legal system relied heavily on coerced confessions, and torture during interrogations was widespread. The conviction hung on testimony from the accomplice, a man with every reason to shift blame elsewhere. Shiratori denied the stabbing for the rest of his life, and no court ever formally overturned that original conviction. Guards at Aomori Prison beat Shiratori on a regular basis and turned his own surname into a weapon, since the characters in Shiratori translate to white bird or swan, which gave them ammunition for slurs and mockery. Protesting only earned him 4 months in solitary confinement, where the abuse continued without interruption. That confinement is where he decided to break out. 30 days of careful observation gave him the entire guard patrol schedule, including a 15-minute gap during the overnight shift change. Bath time provided the material he needed because prisoners received wooden buckets bound with thin metal wire hoops, and Shiratori peeled off a wire and smuggled it back to his cell. Pressing that wire against the lock mechanism through the food delivery slot on the outside of the door, he shaped a crude lockpick over multiple nights. The night he chose, loose floorboards went under his futon to mimic a sleeping body. The cell lock clicked open, and additional doors, and the rear gate followed, until he slipped through a cracked skylight and disappeared into darkness. Recapture came within days, and the escape charge pushed his sentence up to life imprisonment. Transfer orders bounced him through several facilities after that, first to Miyagi Prison in 1937, then to Kosuge Prison in Tokyo by 1940. Kosuge introduced him to the one guard who ever showed him basic decency, a man named Kobayashi Ryozo, and under Kobayashi's watch, Shiratori became a model prisoner who caused 0 trouble. That changed in October 1941, when wartime transfer orders pulled him out of Kosuge and dropped him into Akita Prison. Everything he'd endured before was about to look mild by comparison. Akita Prison constructed a cell specifically designed for escape risks, with 3-meter ceilings Walls lined in smooth copper sheeting that offered no grip whatsoever. A single small skylight mounted far above reach, and mandatory handcuffing at all hours. Warm clothing requests went ignored through the bitter Akita winter, and beatings continued as standard practice. Shiratori reportedly looked at his captors and told them in a low, threatening voice, "I will escape." What the builders of that cell hadn't accounted for was rot. The wooden framing around the skylight had started to decay, and Shiratori spotted it. A scrap of tin, and an old nail found inside the cell became a tiny serrated saw, and that's when the nightly routine began. Every guard changeover gave him a window of action. Pressing both palms flat against one copper wall and his bare feet against the opposite wall, Shiratori inched upward through friction alone, using what's known as a chimney climb. Each session at the top of the cell lasted roughly 10 minutes before the next patrol forced him to descend, and during those 10 minutes, he sawed at the rotting skylight frame, night after night, week after week. Patient repetition loosened the frame enough to remove it entirely. June 15th, 1942, brought a violent thunderstorm, which is exactly what Shiratori had been waiting for. Rain and thunder covered the sounds of his movements on the roof as he climbed out through the skylight, dropped onto lumber from the prison workshop, and scaled the outer wall into open country. From Akita, Shiratori walked an estimated 500 kilometers toward Tokyo, searching for the one authority figure he trusted, Guard Chief Kobayashi. Whether he surrendered voluntarily at Kosuge Prison or Kobayashi himself contacted police, the outcome was the same. Nobody listened to his appeal about the abuse. 3 more years landed on his sentence courtesy of the Tokyo District Court, and in April of 1943, the prison system sent him to the one facility no inmate had ever escaped from, Abashiri Prison in northern Hokkaido, the place the Japanese called their Alcatraz. Abashiri sat at the northern edge of Hokkaido, the most isolated prison in the entire country, and its escape record stood at 0. The conditions Shiratori faced inside represented the worst of everything he'd survived up to that point. A special ward cell became his permanent home, and he never left it. Hokkaido winters drove temperatures far below freezing, and the guards dressed him in thin summer clothing through every one of them. Summer brought the opposite: punishment, heavy padded winter garments. Standing up invited a beating. Food rations came at 1/4 of the standard amount, and because massive restraints locked his hands behind his back, eating meant pressing his face down into the bowl on the floor. Standard handcuffs lasted about as long as it took Shiratori to grab the chains and tear them apart, bare-handed, while guards stared in shock. The replacement restraints weighed approximately 20 kilograms, fastened with thick bolts, so specialized that a hardware expert had to come in once a week just to remove them for bathing. Those bolts ground his wrists and ankles raw, and the open wounds filled with maggots. Shiratori's own words, captured years later by a journalist, put it plainly. "I learned, for the first time, that maggots can grow on a living person." Death felt close in that cell, and he decided that escaping or dying in the attempt were his only 2 options. This is where the most famous detail of the entire story takes shape. Every meal of miso soup, often the only food Shiratori received in a day, became a corrosion tool. Deliberately dripping and spitting the liquid onto his restraint bolts and onto the iron bars of the food delivery slot, Shiratori weaponized the high salt content of that soup against the metal holding him. Salt accelerates the oxidation of iron dramatically, and day after day, for months, and possibly up to a full year, that slow chemical reaction ate through the metal. Guards who inspected the cell after the escape found a horribly corroded bolt covered in salty residue, which confirmed the technique. Wartime conditions played directly into Shiratori's hands on this one. Japan's metal requisitioning orders during the war meant corroded handcuffs and iron bars could not be replaced with fresh materials. The guards simply didn't have new metal to swap in. August 26th, 1944 arrived with a wartime blackout, and Shiratori made his move. Corroded restraints broke apart. Loosened iron bars came free from the food slot. And then came the part that sounds impossible. Shiratori dislocated both of his own shoulders to compress his frame through an opening roughly 20 by 40 centimeters, far too narrow for any normal person to fit. A skylight shattered under his headbutt, and the Hokkaido wilderness swallowed him whole. No inmate had ever escaped Abashiri before that night. None have since. An abandoned mine deep in the Hokkaido mountains became Shiratori's home for the next stretch of his life, where foraged plants, nuts, berries, rabbits, and raccoons kept him alive through multiple brutal winters spent entirely alone. Civilization caught up with him in 1946, when he descended to a village, walked into a school, and picked up a newspaper. That's how Yoshie Shiratori learned Japan had surrendered in World War II, and that atomic bombs had fallen on his country. Starvation drove him toward Sapporo, and along the way, a farmer caught him stealing vegetables from a field. The farmer came at him with a farming tool, and the struggle that followed ended with Shiratori fatally stabbing the man. Arrests came quickly. The Sapporo District Court handed down a death sentence. Sapporo Prison's death row architects threw everything they had at building an escape-proof cell for Shiratori. Reinforced doors, reinforced walls, reinforced skylights, every window cut smaller than his head, ceilings raised high enough to prevent climbing, and 6 dedicated guards assigned to watch him every hour of every day. And then they made the one mistake that gave everything away. Convinced the cell was unbeatable, they left his hands free. Shiratori responded with one of the more brilliant pieces of psychological manipulation in prison history. Day after day, he sat and stared straight up at the ceiling, training the guards to fixate on what was above him. Ceiling inspections became obsessive. Skylight reinforcements piled up, and every ounce of their attention drifted upward. The floor beneath his bed never crossed their minds. A metal fragment, smuggled from the washroom area, became a small saw, and at night, Shiratori cut through the wooden floorboards beneath his bed to reveal a 60-centimeter crawl space between the floor and the ground. Sharpened miso soup bowls served as improvised shovels for a tunnel, roughly 2 meters long, that extended past the building's foundation. Sawdust, mixed with existing dust, concealed the evidence. Tools went into the toilet bucket, and weekly ceiling inspections continued to miss everything happening below. March 31st, 1947 was the night. Shiratori crawled through his tunnel, found accumulated snow on the other side, used it as a platform to scale the outer wall, and vanished into Hokkaido's spring darkness. Freedom lasted roughly 10 months this time around. Drifting to the outskirts of Sapporo, he picked up odd jobs and introduced himself as Kimura to anyone who asked. January 19th, 1948 brought a police officer on routine patrol through a neighborhood near Sapporo, face to face with a suspicious-looking man hauling a large bundle. The man gave his name as Kimura, and the officer searched his bag, finding only pots, kettles, and bowls inside. Nothing illegal, nothing worth holding him for. The officer was ready to wave him on. That's when the man asked, quietly, if the officer could spare him a cigarette. Cigarettes in post-war Japan cost more than most people could afford, but the officer handed one over anyway. Shiratori smoked it without saying a word. And then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Thank you, sir. Honestly, my name is not Kimura. It's Yoshie Shiratori. I am an escaped convict." Years later, Shiratori explained what happened in that moment. His entire life had been so empty of human kindness that one small, generous act from a stranger cut straight through every defense he'd built across decades of abuse and isolation. The man who had beaten every lock, every wall, every set of restraints, and every prison the system could throw at him, gave himself up because someone handed him a cigarette. Shiratori's case landed at the Sapporo High Court, and for the first time in his life, a courtroom actually gave him a fair hearing. 3 findings came out of it that changed everything. The farmer's death was ruled self-defense, since the farmer had attacked Shiratori first. Across all 4 escapes, spanning more than a decade, Shiratori had never once harmed a prison guard, despite clearly possessing the physical ability to overpower any of them. And the court formally accepted his testimony about systematic abuse as a factor that warranted leniency. With that, the death sentence disappeared. 20 years for his escapes replaced it, and his request to serve that time at Fuchu Prison in Tokyo went through. Fuchu turned out to be the place where the cycle finally broke. The warden treated Shiratori like a normal human being. No handcuffs, no beatings, no insults. Garden work filled his days, athletics filled his evenings, and year after year he won the prison sumo tournament, reportedly without ever losing a match. 14 years at Fuchu passed without a single escape attempt. One afternoon, the story goes, the warden pointed at the garden wall, only about 2 meters high, and asked why someone with Shiratori's abilities hadn't simply climbed over it. Shiratori smiled and answered with 2 words, "I'm tired." That warden started the paperwork for parole. December 22nd, 1961 was the day Yoshie Shiratori walked out the front gate of Fuchu Prison at age 54. Behind him sat approximately 26 years of captivity. Construction, labor, and odd jobs filled the years after his release. All of it lived under parole supervision that Shiratori described as invisible iron chains. His wife had died while he served his sentence. At some point, he traveled back to Aomori and caught sight of his daughter, but shame kept him from speaking to her. Journalist Saito Mitsunori tracked him down during those final years and conducted the only known in-depth interviews with the Escape King, conversations that became the foundation of a book published in 1985, titled The Escape King. Testimony of Yoshie Shiratori. That book, combined with the physical evidence at Abashiri and the surviving court records, forms the primary source for nearly everything we know about this man, a heart attack. Took Yoshie Shiratori on February 24, 1979, in Aomori, 71 years old. His body nearly went unclaimed, but a woman who had lived next door to him during his parole years stepped forward to arrange a proper burial. Shiratori's story has woven itself deeply into Japanese popular culture, across generations. Akira Yoshimura's 1983 novel Hagoku, which translates to Prison Break, won the prestigious Yomiuri Prize in 1984 and spawned both an NHK drama and a 2017 film that starred Takeshi Kitano. The manga Golden Kamuy, serialized between 2014 and 2022, features a character named Yoshitake Shiraishi, who carries the nickname Escape King and shares Shiratori's joint dislocation abilities and Abashiri Prison backstory, all confirmed as intentional by the author. That character ranked 6th in popularity polls and carried Shiratori's story to an entirely new international audience. Over in Hokkaido, the original Abashiri prison buildings have been preserved as important cultural properties inside a museum. Visitors pass a life-sized mannequin of Shiratori mounted overhead in the solitary confinement corridor, frozen in the act of squeezing through the food hatch during his 3rd escape. The actual cell where he lived sits intact. And down in the cafeteria, the museum serves prison meals, grilled fish with rice and miso soup. There's a quote from Shiratori that captures everything about who he was. "It was a cell built by humans," he said, "so it can be broken by a human." 4 escapes proved him right on that count. But the most telling part of Yoshie Shiratori's life isn't the brilliance of how he got out. It's the pattern of what kept him in. Fuchu Prison held him for 14 years, even though the garden wall stood only 2 meters high, and his skills could have carried him over it any night he chose. The locks hadn't gotten stronger, the walls hadn't gotten taller. What changed was that someone treated him like a person. A cigarette from a stranger ended his last flight. A warden's simple respect ended his need to run. Shiratori's own lawyer framed it best, calling the escapes prison reform practiced with his own body. And that might be the cleanest way to understand a man who proved he could break any cell built by humans, and who stopped breaking them the moment he was treated as one.